Good morning. Give me a second. Welcome to the October 2020 Leadership Academy for Empowerment. I am Rashawn Peak, the Mentor Coordinator, and it is my pleasure to introduce Leah Kill, who will be conducting our workshop today. Leah, I turn it over to you.
Alrighty. Good morning to everyone and welcome whenever it is that you join and get to view this presentation. Today we're going to talk about conflict resolution. So just in the way of introduction, I am a graduate of the Caruso School of Law at Pepperdine University, and we are known as usually the top 1 or 2 dispute resolution schools in the country. So I am grateful to be able to present some of the curriculum that I've learned and the skills that I've put into use throughout my career and in my personal relationships as well, in talking about how one comes to a place of conflict resolution. So the first thing that I think is important in focusing on conflict resolution is really getting clear about what your values are in the conflict that is at hand. So you have all different types of relationships, from your relationships with individuals, your relationships with your community, your relationships within your household, and with organizations and entities that you interact with. So anything from getting a dozen of eggs at the grocery store and 2 of them being broken and having to return them being a small conflict, to a conflict about how your classes are being conducted over virtual. These are all different levels of conflict and different areas where conflict can arise. And so you want to really be clear about what your values are and what's at stake in the area where the conflict is arising. So again, going back to the grocery store, a dozen eggs costs anywhere from $1.50 to $5. And so you look at, if 2 of them are broken and you need to exchange the product, what's at stake? Is it a few cents or is it nearly $1? And what does that impact on your budget? And so when we look at some of the issues around interpersonal relationships, your relationships between individual people and yourself, or relationships with larger groups of people, whether it's a small group community like empowerment, or whether it's a larger community like your entire classroom. These are the stakes, and what's at hand, is really, everything is at a different level. So I think the first and most important step in figuring out how you resolve a conflict is really setting the stage and understanding what your values are and what is at stake in that first interaction, in that level of interaction that you have. So with October being National Bullying Prevention Month, we're going to try to talk about interacting with individuals and individuals within a smaller group community, and really look at how bullying can play a role in where a conflict would arise, and then how we work through resolving that conflict. So let's put for instance, again, on a small group community like empowerment or your classroom. And if there is a negative engagement that takes place, that basically what I would call a breach of the peace. So there's a normal way that the order is conducted within each environment. You know, there is a place of where you can say you peacefully are existing with the other parties that are there. And so the conflict arises where that peace is somehow breached. And it can be, you know, a misunderstanding. It could be somebody willfully taking an action that is against you or violates what the community has decided is the rules of the road, the rules of engagement within that community. And when that happens, this is where your conflict arises. That's the point, you know, where the 1 + 1 = 2. You know, you have the community, you have the breach of how things are normally conducted, and therefore you now have conflict. So one of the things that I want to look at past, you know, understanding your values and what's at stake in your individual communities are the different strategies of how we frame the resolution to the conflict that we are engaged in. One of the most popular forms of conflict resolution that exists now that wasn't really talked about, it was really more like a pie in the sky idea when I was your age and first learning about mediation and conflict resolution, is what's called restorative justice. Now, restorative justice can be a really big concept, but I want to make sure we can apply it and bring it down right here to where we're having this conversation, and right as it would apply to you guys in the communities that you're currently involved in. When you look at the sort of plain language definition of restorative justice, you're really looking at a lesson where you place a high value on having the person that's been harmed have an encounter with the person who has harmed them. And in that encounter, you want to exchange the ideas so that everyone is clear what the conflict is. So that's step one. Encountering each other and getting clear as to what the conflict is. So you have to really discuss what it is that brought you to this place of conflict. You know, what norm of the community was broken? What was said that injured your feelings? Was something of your personal items removed from your possession? Any type of thing that have occurred needs to be very clear as to why you each find yourself one on one side and another on another side of this issue. And that's the conflict. And so when you establish what the conflict is, that then allows you to go to the next step, which is the acknowledgement that a wrong has been done. And so for a lot of people, this is where things get a little tricky. And they get tricky because oftentimes people don't see eye to eye on where we've gone wrong in our interaction with others or in our interactions with groups and spaces that we participate. And so you have to be really clear about where the conflict arose and really clear about the values of the community or the relationship so that you can then say, this is how we got off track from what this relationship is governed by. This is where we got off track with the rules of the organization that we're a part of. And in doing that, once you establish what the conflict is, and then you can both acknowledge where the harm occurred and who initiated the harm, you can then move through to the next step. And this is the beginning of how you repair the conflict, the beginning of how you repair the relationship and start to repair and reconcile the conflict. And so in the restorative justice framework, which is our first way that we're going to look at conflict resolution, our first strategy for conflict resolution, the next step after you establish the conflict and are clear about the harm that was done is about making amends. And so in the restorative justice framework, when you look at amends, the person who was harmed really gets to set the standard of what it is that they want to happen. And, you know, some people would look at, you know, it has to be an eye for an eye. And if those are your values and those values are supported by the organization or within the relationship that you're trying to repair, then you guys get to be clear about that. Yeah, you get to exchange those ideas that I think the exact thing that was done against me should be is the exact thing that should be repaired. You know, the conflict is that I have $5 that you have $5 that once belonged to me, so I need you to return that $5. The exact same thing for the exact same thing that was taken, or the exact harm that was done, that it needs to be restored. And so that's one way of looking at it. When you look at the idea of making amends, sometimes you don't have the capacity to give an eye for an eye, to give exactly what was taken for what was given. And this is where your values as the person who was potentially harmed comes in to really ask for what it is that you need in this exchange in order to restore your confidence, in order to move forward in dealing with this person at the same place that you were before. So this is a lot of times where people might get a little lost, but this is where the restoration in the restorative part of the justice comes in. You're trying to restore the relationship, to go back to that place of peace, to restore your confidence that you can, that this person can become trustworthy again, to be dealt with in the way that they were before they'd done anything that was wrong. And so this is the challenge. And this is why both people really have to be clear on their values. The person has to be clear who did the harm, that they have a value above this thing negative that they've done, and that they can be restored back to the place of existing in the community or existing in relationship with you that looks very much like where they were before. You know, some people would say, you know, I can forgive, but I won't forget. And, you know, that really isn't a type of conflict resolution that exists well in the restorative justice framework necessarily. And so one of the other ways of conflict resolution that we'll explore in a few minutes may be better suited to a person whose values are more along the lines of a forgiving but not forgetting type of mindset about dealing with conflict. So when you're making these amends in restorative justice as this first sort of really big, the most encapsulating version of conflict resolution, you really have to keep in mind that you're trying to restore the relationship. You're trying to restore the interaction so that people can exist now after the harm in a way that they existed before the harm was done. And so if you believe that that is something that is within your capacity to do, both the person who inflicted the harm and the person who received the harm, if you both can agree that this is the goal, the restorative justice as a means of conflict resolution may be the very right way for you all to go. there's a lot of context that restorative justice is used in. Many school districts are starting to use this framework in dealing with both staff and personnel conflicts with students, student relationships, organization to organization conflicts, and it's proving very helpful. But this is, like I said, this is the sort of the biggest way. This is like one of the most challenging ways, because to be able to have a negative interaction with someone, to have a conflict arise between two entities, two people, and then move past that to put the structures in place where the person who was harmed or the entity that was harmed can ask for what they need, and the person who did the harm can basically humble themselves to say that they can restore what it was that they diminished from the community, and then would like to be treated as if this harm hadn't been done or exist in the way in relationship before the harm was done. That's a big ask. And a lot of times in relationships and in the way that we deal interpersonally with others, and the way that we deal organization to organization, or we deal with our responsibilities within organizations, it becomes very challenging to allow things to occur that are not positive, and then move through the process of restoring the relationship back to something that looks very much like what you had before the breach began. So that's kind of like the general overview and the goals of restorative justice. And it definitely, there are a lot of different other points that you can touch on as you try to navigate that. And I will also send some tools and resources that kind of let you get some more for instances, and you could see how this particular type of reconciliation model would work in your specific circumstances. You'd be able to like really look at it and say, would this really work in this case, or whether I should use one of these other the other tools that are going to be presented today. But remember, with this first conflict resolution style of restorative justice, that you are asking for the relationship to be restored into something that looks like what you had before the harm occurred. So the next conflict resolution style that we want to focus on is making amends. And so a lot of times this is not something that people are completely unfamiliar with, but it oftentimes takes you to see it in action for you to get how it works. One of the sort of pop culture instances that I can think of where I saw this in action is the Netflix show Trinkets. So the basic premise, if you haven't seen it, is a relationship between three friends that forms at basically like an anonymous meeting. And so it's for Shoplifters Anonymous, and these three young ladies all have had issues with shoplifting. And so they go to this kind of community support group in order to help them work through and meet their responsibilities as it relates to the consequences that they're facing for having shoplifted from retailers. And so in the midst of the storyline, one of the young ladies decides that in performing her steps to sort of get clear of her issues around shoplifting, she decides that she's going to make amends. And in making those amends, she collects up all the things that she had taken from various places, and she goes in and tries to return them. So let's think about this. You have a retail situation and somebody comes in with merchandise that they have taken from the store and they have not paid for it. Now, this can look different from all types of ways. You know, this could look different from whether you are, you know, a person who could have afforded what you took and you just took it in order to take it. This could be a situation of, you know, this was how you were trying to provide for a need that you couldn't have met. And one would hope that all of those things are taken into consideration when the person who was harmed by the shoplifting, whether they would accept your amends or not, because the amends could look a number of different ways. It could be to simply return the items, but technically the items are used. Or it could be for you to return the items and still have to pay for them. And so in this particular instance on the show Trinkets, she has a number of returns that she tries to make, and they all go different ways. Some of the people, they just kind of look the other way. Some of the people actually confront her on what she'd done and what she was asking their expectations to be. But her thing was, her making amends was not just to satisfy what it was that the retailers were asking of her, but she was also trying to challenge herself in what she was asking of herself, that she no longer wanted to be considered as someone who would remove things from the stores without paying for them. And she wanted to be able to see herself in the mirror. So the amends was as much about trying to make the retailers whole as it was about her trying to make herself whole in the view that she has of herself and how she wants to continue to conduct herself within the community, within the relationships that she had at home, and within the relationships that she has as a customer with the retail environment. So when you look at this second type of conflict resolution strategy of making amends, again, it is, values very much come into play with the idea of whether or not you can fix the area where the conflict occurred. And that takes something from the person who, again, breached the peace. You know, it takes something from the person who the breach was done against. And it also takes both sides being clear about their values in what takes place normally, and now what's going to take place beyond the point where things have gotten broken. And so that's the second conflict resolution strategy. And again, we will give you some additional resources to see if the making amends conflict resolution strategy better fits your type of conflict that you may have. I think a lot of times with like cyberbullying or person-to-person present, I guess, being bullied in person by another, the making amends strategy oftentimes is a lesser desired role. It would definitely work better in like the example that's provided by the television show, because when you're trying to amend either physical harm or emotional harm, have someone to be able to satisfy that back to you is difficult. And in those cases, something like restorative justice, which has a lot of different levels that you can go through and a lot of ways to bring satisfaction to a harm that was done, ends up being a better strategy. But we want to give you some different strategies so that depending on what your issue is or where your issue arises, that you have more than one tool to go and rely on in order to bring a piece back to your relationship or how you exist with an entity or within a community. So the third conflict resolution strategy that we're going to talk about is one strategy that focuses more on reconciliation than it does on righting the wrong. And again, this strategy, like all the others, really requires that you be clear about your values, that you be clear about the harm that was done or the harm that you inflicted, and then the person who has received the harm or the entity that was harmed in the process gets to basically set the new rules of the road. How do we go forward different than how we got here? You know, you begin to ask these questions about reconciliation, and if I am able to give disclosure for me in my conflict resolution, this has been the strategy that I'm least reliant on, because I'm one of those people that likes to know what the rules are going in from the outset. You know, let's set the rules of the road and let's everybody try to keep to what those rules are. And when it goes off of course, and now you have to create something, a new way of going forward that may be vastly different than what you set up in the beginning. This is definitely more difficult for my personal personality type, but for other people, this is great. You know, it gives them the opportunity to come to the table and say, okay, this is what happened. Here are maybe some of the weaknesses in how we were first dealing with each other. Here are the weaknesses and the rules that we set up as to how we were going to move forward together. And so now we have the opportunity to go, you know, kind of hit reset. And with the reconciliation, you don't lose the good things. You just get an opportunity to sort of scratch out the things that weren't working, the things that allow for harms to be done. And then you go into that new place and decide how you want to go forward from here. Now, one of the great things about a reconciliation strategy as a means of conflict resolution is this. If you and another, or you and in your interaction with your community or with an entity, come to the table to say that our highest goal in resolving conflict is going to be reconciling, then that means each party comes to the table with the confidence of knowing that the door is not going to be closed, that this is not an ending, but this is a new beginning. And so each time that one may have a difference with another, you can look for that new way of going forward. And a lot of people find a great amount of comfort in community and relationships that give them the grace to mess up and then know that they can still have the relationship, they can still have the interaction, the means to going forward, and that they're not going to just be shut out from their ability to interact with that person or with that entity, and they're able to really keep that relationship going, you know, continuing forward, even if one or more sides than one messes up. And so, Rashawn, if I can have you put up that next, that second slide that I sent you. When we talk about this idea of conflict resolution, one of the things you always want to keep in great focus are your values? And especially with where we are in the world today, with the way in which people are dealing with their problems that are existing on a national and international scale, you know, I think we would all be doing a lot better if people were clear about their values and their intentions, and then the impacts of their actions despite what their intentions are. And so there's a quote from Dr. Cornel West, and he says that justice is what love looks like in public. And I just want to focus in on that for a minute, because I think this is a very powerful tool when it comes to looking at conflict resolution. Everybody, for the most part, can agree that when they've been harmed, that they want justice. And that is not always what is given or afforded. But the brilliance, in my opinion, of what Dr. West proposes here is looking at something else that we all have our own relationship, our own acquaintance with, which is love, and then realize if I was able to portray love in this relationship, but it was publicly viewed, then that is what justice would be. And so when I bring up this point, I think whether we're talking about restorative justice, whether we're talking about making amends, whether we're talking about reconciliation, or any other style of conflict resolution, if you can get real clear on what love looks like in this interaction, then I think you can use any of these tools in almost any circumstance to get the justice that is required for any harms that have been done. When you can say that, you know, I love myself, I love my physical integrity, and in order for me to then take that practice of loving myself, loving my community, loving my family, then the just result is how that love is performed between you and another, or how that love is performed between you and the entity that you've chosen to interact with. So I hope that this is the beginning of a roadmap. I hope that the resources that you're supplied with on these 3 core conflict resolution strategies can really help you to think through and navigate the places that you need to go in order to maintain and restore peace in your relationship, your interactions with your communities, and your interactions with the organizations and entities that you deal with through this period of your life. And as you institute and as you apply these different techniques and you see what works and what doesn't, and what fits you and what doesn't fit you, you will then really just begin to grow in your knowledge of both your comfort, your willingness, and your ability to solve conflicts when they occur. And you can just use those tools, like I said, in every different area, whether it's from returning your eggs to the grocery store to trying to have a relationship with a friend after there's been a breach, to possibly begin a relationship with someone who's been, you know, just an acquaintance, someone you just encountered, you know, you encountered them in passing and something has broken between you guys, even though you don't have a set relationship. Again, I'm sure you will be able to receive the resources that give you, you know, definitions written out of what each strategy is, and not just how I performed them and how I came to learn them and places that I've seen and encountered them. but also give you some more for instances and some further clarity on how one how one approaches conflict resolution in everyday life. In addition to that, I will supply my email address, and you guys can feel free to contact me and ask specific questions, ask for additional resources. And I hope that this particular information serves you into having peaceful relationships and having an understanding how to restore that peace when things go off track. Thank you for your participation in the workshop. I look forward to questions and interacting with you all online in the future.